Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and today I want to share with you a fun little adventure that I set myself upon sometime in mid to late 2024. For years, I've toyed around with the idea of earning every platinum trophy in the Final Fantasy franchise, just because why not? I've played every Final Fantasy game probably more than I really should admit, but I haven't ever committed to earning the platinum trophies in a lot of them. I've 100%ed some of them on Steam and have a platinum trophy here or there, but platinuming every Final Fantasy game is, well, kind of an ordeal. However, I set myself upon this in mid to late 2024, and I have made decent enough headway that I want to start kind of documenting my experience with platinuming each and every game. So, in each video, I'm going to be covering one or more Final Fantasy games with some commentary on advice that I would give somebody else working for it and some of the hurdles that you may run into if you are attempting these trophies. Before we go any further though, this video does have a sponsor, Magic Spoon. If you've been around the channel for a while, you recognize them, but if not, let me give you the down low. Magic Spoon is a brand that gives me all sorts of options for my protein intake, just so I can keep it varied. As a cereal snacker, it's always good to have something like their treat bars around, which I'll usually devour far too quickly every month that they send them, and their new granola, which I also devour probably way too quickly. Listen, they both really hit the spot when I need a good snack to sate my body after a tough workout, and I do like snacking. Now, if you'd like to try Magic Spoon while also supporting the channel, then click the link below to get some today. Build your own custom box of products with tons of available flavors. Again, the treat bars and the granola. Oh, trust me, you're not going to be able to stop yourself. Best of all, use my link and discount code Mr. Happy to get $5 off of your box. You can also get it at your local grocery store or even on Amazon. And if you don't like it, Magic Spoon has a 100% happiness guarantee. Let them know and they'll refund you, no questions asked. So click the link below or scan the QR code on the screen and use code Mr. Happy to get $5 off, or go to magicspoon.com/Mr. Happy to save $5 on your order. It even works in Canada and the UK. Thanks again to Magic Spoon for sponsoring, and now on with the video. Now first, let me be perfectly clear, because even while I was live streaming this, a lot of people were confused about the idea of platinuming games, because not everybody plays games on PlayStation. A lot of people play on Steam or Xbox or Switch, or just don't understand the lingo because PlayStation just has a different one. The Platinum Trophy is a singular trophy that is earned upon gaining every other vanilla trophy that a game actually has. It's very rare that a Platinum Trophy is ever updated or a second one is introduced, meaning that if all of the contents of the base game are completed and all of those trophies are earned, you have the platinum even if more DLC comes out, and there would be trophies that would be added to those. Those usually just have more trophies and in no way kind of add to the platinum experience. It just means that your profile will no longer say 100% trophy completion. My goal is specifically the Platinum Trophy, meaning that if there are DLCs that would inhibit the 100%, that I don't need to go for those. That being said, I do plan on doubling back and getting the 100% so long as it's feasible. There will be titles that I bring up later that I don't really know if that's going to be, not even that it won't be possible, but I haven't yet decided if I want to go down that route. I'm not all too dedicated to the idea. So, for now, I am going to be focusing on a couple of individual goals. First, I would like to obtain all of the main numbered Final Fantasy title Platinum trophies. This includes Final Fantasies 1 through 10, 12 through 16, as well as the sequels of 10 and 13, and that of 10-2, 13-2, and Lightning Returns. After I have all of those, I will then decide to go back and do the side titles, things like Crisis Core, Crystal Chronicles, Stranger Paradise, some of which I already have, but those are just some examples of the other titles within the Final Fantasy franchise that I will be attempting. I will also say I am contemplating doing a faux Final Fantasy XI trophy run, as the game's original Xbox 360 achievements are at least listed online, even if they are no longer obtainable on Xbox and were never available on PlayStation as trophies. Truth be told, I have most of them already. There's only really 2 or 3 I would have to go out of my way to get, but that could be a fun little video to go over at some point. So like I said, I did have some platinums before deciding to do this challenge, though markedly less than I thought I had. Before starting, I had platinums in Final Fantasy VIII Remastered, Final Fantasy XII Zodiac Age, Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy XV, Final Fantasy XVI, Final Fantasy VII Remake on PS4 and PS5, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I also had a couple of side titles done, like World of Final Fantasy and Stranger of Paradise, with several others at least somewhat underway. I know my Theater Rhythm Platinum is actually very close to being complete, and that will probably be the first side title I finish after I'm done with all of the main numbered titles. That leaves Final Fantasies 1 through 7, Final Fantasy 9, 10, 10, 2, 13, 13, 2, 14 on both PS4 and 5, as well as the side titles that would come after that. So, like I said, there's a lot, but fortunately we get to start in a pretty simple place, in that of the Final Fantasy 1 through 6 Pixel Remaster, the platinums that I will be covering in this first video. So for this video, we have to start at the beginning of the franchise with the Final Fantasy 1 through 6 Pixel Remasters. I actually had all of these 100%ed on Steam because they came out on PC long before they came out on console, but I never bothered to get the PlayStation equivalent trophies and achievements. Oops. Well, guess it's time to do it now. So let's head back to the classic Final Fantasy games for probably the billionth time in my life and get those platinums. Now, the Pixel Remasters are kind of just one large bundle. While you can buy them all individually and all their trophy lists are individual, it's kind of just tackling it all as one thing anyway. I even have the physical copy of Final Fantasy 1 through 6 Pixel Remaster. And because these games are all bundled together, they all have very similar quality of life, and they even have very similar trophies. They basically all have a few of the same ones. Obviously, beat the game, that's kind of a standard for every game, but also completing the bestiary, meaning that you have to defeat every monster in every game, minus a few special cases. You have to visit every world map location, collect every treasure and or hidden items depending on the game, and level your characters to a certain degree, again varying with each game. Some it's level 50, some it's 99, and some have entirely different rule sets altogether. Probably the most notorious one for every game is to complete the bestiary, which requires, again, killing one of every monster. This means diligence is key, and depending on the game, this particular part can get kind of messy, especially if you're someone who doesn't track these kind of things, follow a guide, or have some sort of reference sheet handy. With that, let's start getting into the games though, starting with Final Fantasy 1. Now, if you would like to start this journey, I would highly recommend starting with Final Fantasy 1, not just because it's the first in the franchise, but because it is also one of the most straightforward platinum trophies in the entire franchise. Completing the story and generic achievements I listed before pretty much summarizes the entire game's trophy list. The bestiary does have some annoying entries, as Final Fantasy 1 has several rare spawns across its many dungeons, most notably the War Mech in the Flying Fortress. It's the franchise's first super boss technically, but if you're a high enough level, it'll topple over in a matter of turns. Other trophies to consider are obtaining the Excalibur sword from a side quest, starting the hidden minigame on the boat simply by holding X and pressing O a ton of times until it pops up, and having your jobs advanced by giving Bahamut the rat tail item. Fortunately, Final Fantasy 1 is one of the very few entries in the entire franchise that has no missable trophies. Every area can be visited and revisited at the end of the game, so all that matters is making sure that you complete your checklist of objectives. I think this is maybe the only one with no missable trophies until Final Fantasy 12? 14, obviously, you can't miss anything permanently. Maybe 15, I'd have to look again. Either way, enjoy it, because things do get worse from here. It's also worth noting that the Pixel Remasters do have cheats that you can enable, which you can use to either speed up or slow down your progress. If you're playing for the trophies, you probably don't care about preserving the original game's leveling curve, gil intake, or anything at all. So odds are, like me, you're going to turn on all of those cheats just to blitz through the games. And if you do, you're probably looking at a 10, maybe 15-hour platinum at most if you're not too familiar with Final Fantasy 1. And to be clear, that's close to true for most of the Pixel Remasters I'm going to be talking about today, with some of them getting closer to 20-ish hours just because they can have some frustrating trophies. Now, moving on to Final Fantasy II, this platinum isn't that much different from Final Fantasy I, though the game's mechanisms are wildly different. This game doesn't have traditional levels, opting instead to level individual skills and spells by using them repeatedly. Higher level skills must be used against higher level opponents, or maybe even just hitting yourself in the face in order to keep leveling them. Instead of a normal leveling trophy, you instead have to raise a single weapon skill and a single magic skill to 16, which is fortunately pretty easy with the boost turned on by the end of the game. Just make sure that you stick to a weapon type on most characters and just keep attacking everything until it gets to that point. If you're doing it without cheats, you might have to get creative for the last several levels, as it's never really intended for you to take things to 16 really in Final Fantasy II. For spells, you'll probably end up leveling Cure to the maximum level, so I would probably just go about spamming that. It can be used in combat, it can be used out of combat, and all contribute to its actual level, so that's the one I would recommend. However, Final Fantasy II begins the trend of having missable trophies. There is a keyword system where you trigger certain conversations by stating certain words to certain NPCs, certainly. Several are missable if not done before certain story events occur. One of these makes obtaining the Excalibur sword much more difficult, which is required for another trophy. Ideally, you'll be following a guide and not really have to worry about missing this again, because it would make a second trophy just harder to do in general. There are also a ton of missable bestiary entries and treasures, since several areas cannot be revisited after story events occur. The Dreadnought, Leviathan Cyclone, and Castle Palamecia can only be visited a single time, so you must make sure your checklist is 100% done in those areas. Feel free to reference online guides and constantly pull up the in-game bestiary just to double check. Fortunately, the Pixel remasters also feature a map system where you can actually see if you have every treasure or every hidden item in a zone before moving on. So if you are missing something, make sure you figure out where it is or what it is. Sometimes in some games, it's an item that is relevant to the story, but don't take that idea for granted. Always be double checking, especially when it comes to those specific areas. Speaking of treasure, Altair, Finn, and Castle Dace also have missables after certain story events occur, and some loot from these areas is only available for short periods of time. So any guide that you're following will likely be making note of that, but keep that in mind as you're progressing to be diligent about looting those places as you move further and further. Now, there are also two missable world map locations, the Rebel Camp and Gatria. These will completely go away when story events occur, so find out when they are available and make sure to at least just take a foot and step it into these areas. Honestly, just be diligent about any and all story events and what is locked after doing each of them. From this game on, you should 100% be following guides and making multiple saves. Some games are less troublesome and some are infinitely worse, but this one should set the trend of doing those two things. Now on to Final Fantasy III. There are actually fewer missables here than in Final Fantasy II, since only a few locations and enemies become inaccessible throughout the game. For locations, I recommend entering the Living Woods before being abducted into Castle Hine. It becomes inaccessible after that. I actually made this mistake on my Steam version, but was able to load up a save and step into it after the fact. I was surprised that that ended up working, but very grateful I didn't have to play through the whole game again, just to sit through one area and then visit everything else afterwards. Speaking of Castle Hine, it's one of the few locations only accessible a single time. The enemies inside will also become inaccessible after you clear it. The only other area that has that problem is Doga's Grotto, which has another handful of enemies, I think like 3 enemies off the top of my head. Many lists online may state that even more enemies are missable. This is just because in the NES and 3D versions, some areas do become inaccessible after leaving, though in the Pixel remaster, that's no longer the case for quite a few of them. The rest is just making sure you pick everything up. Hidden items are introduced in this game, and they are unmarked items hidden in pots, trees, fields, etc. It's just another thing to track, alongside leveling a job to 99, opening all the chests, and of course, finishing the bestiary. Honestly, shouldn't be too bad of a problem, especially with the job leveling boost. Now, Final Fantasy IV is a game that was much worse to do once upon a time, specifically on its initial Steam release. Oddly enough, this is not because of missables, but because this game has a ton of really low drop rate items. The 4 bonus summons and the Pinktail item used to have the potential to be grueling and tedious to farm. I spent 8+ hours between these 5 items alone on PC launch. Fortunately, the item's drop rate has been made far more frequent now, so this platinum isn't that much harder than Final Fantasy III. Now, the Towers of Zot, Babel, and the Giant of Babel are all one-time dungeons, so every treasure, bestiary entry, and hidden items associated with them need to be obtained before you finish them. The Tower of Babel can make you especially nervous since the dungeon is technically entered twice and has 2 different enemy lists. Some online lists are really good at noting when an enemy is only available in the first half, and that some enemies are only available in the second half. But that means both trips you need to actually be diligent, so make sure you know exactly what spawns and where. It's also worth mentioning, but even in some previous titles, I haven't brought this up to this point, plenty of enemies are only available on certain floors in certain dungeons, and a lot of online resources often miss noting this. You may need some extra Google searches to find out exactly what screens some enemies can be found on, and even then, a lot of those enemies can be quite rare, even as bad as a 1 in 64 spawn chance, which, yes, could take you hours if you're really unfortunate, or could take you 5 minutes and you'll wonder why I warned you about it at all. But you don't know where you're going to end up on that scale. Speaking of bestiary entries, some bosses have phases that can be missed entirely by just being too high of a level, meaning that those cheats could actually become a problem if you're not tracking which bosses you have to worry about this on. The General and Kaipo Inn, Calcabrina, and Barnabas Z are the most notable ones that I should mention, because if you kill their first phases too quickly, or you don't actually kill certain phases fast enough in the case of Barnabas Z, they will be missed entirely as a bestiary entry. I'd highly advise making sure after all of those fights that they actually ended up in the bestiary where they're supposed to be, and not to continue on until you're sure of that. There is also a quest to obtain a knife from Yang's wife, and part of this quest is required to obtain the Sylph Summon. While you don't need the knife itself, you should be sure to do the quest when it's noted on guides to make sure you obtain Sylph. The knife itself is also going to be a good throwing item that you'll probably end up hurling at one of the bosses. Other than those few things I've noted, just make sure you have a solid enough amount of patience and a solid enough strategy to obtain the 4 bonus summons and the Pinktail. They may be much easier than they used to be, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to happen instantly. You're just not going to have to spend nearly the same amount of time. I spent maybe an hour to an hour and a half between these 5 items after they were updated, especially because I was a little bit of a hard-headed one and decided to get one of the bonus summons at a time when it's much harder to do. So maybe just don't be as hard-headed as me and do the Mind Flayer a bit later in the game. One thing that especially helps is the use of the Siren item. Fortunately, in the Pixel Remaster, this item can actually be purchased from a vendor later in the game. Otherwise, you would have to actually go out of your way to steal as many of these as possible from a particular enemy in the Tower of Babel. You can still do that if you want, but it's not nearly as important as it used to be. So just have a bunch of gil ready, and if you had the cheat on, you probably do. And those things should go very quickly as well. With that, we move on to Final Fantasy V, and in my opinion, this is where the Platinum Trophies really begin to drain on you. Not nearly as much as some later titles, but you're 5 titles in already, and it's starting to get a little bit more tedious, is going to become noticeable. Final Fantasy V is a game split into 3 separate worlds with limited means of revisiting content as you progress. Many locations can only be visited a single time, and many can only be visited up to a certain point in the story, even if you can technically go back and visit them before reaching that point of no return. 100% you're going to need a guide for this one. You should have been using one at least from Final Fantasy II onward anyway, but with 5, unless you have extensive encyclopedic knowledge of the game, there's a high probability you make a mistake. Now, some tough enemies, such as the Gill Turtle, will require very specific strategies to fell safely before they become unavailable. Remember that this version of Final Fantasy V does not have the bonus dungeons to revisit a lot of these monsters. Other versions of the game do, and a lot of these enemies do come back. Just not this version, so don't take that for granted. Now, some notable things you can do to help keep you on track for a faster platinum are as follows. For one, have a Blue Mage present at all times as soon as you unlock it. You will need to learn every blue magic technique anyway, and many of those spells are actually very good. So just have one in the party. It shouldn't be that big of a deal to do, and you'll probably want to do it anyway. I'd also dedicate one character to be your master character right from the get-go. one achievement requires you to master every job. Now, technically, you don't need to do that all on one character. It's only asking that the job be mastered by any character. However, that gets kind of foiled when you realize that you also need to master the freelancer job. The only way to master freelancer is to master every other job on the same character. So having one character that wastes no AP, never sticks to the same job, as soon as it's mastered they move on, right from the beginning of the game, will save you a lot of headaches. Other than this, it is a completion checklist just with a ton of missables. Keep in mind that some missable lists will cover non-essentials such as important steals, which Final Fantasy V has a ton of. This helps, but with the cheats you'll probably obliterate most things anyway, so only really do that if you think it will help you actually get through the rest of the game. The Genji items, most notably from Gilgamesh, is probably the one most people know. In my opinion, it's very fortunate that Final Fantasy V is one of the higher quality titles amongst the Pixel remasters, and probably one of the better games among the first 6. So it makes some of the grindier elements, such as mastering the jobs and filling out the bestiaries and whatnot, just go a little bit smoother. Even with all of this in mind, my platinum took under 20 hours, and I was afraid about some things, but those cheats really help you in a lot of ways. Then we move on to Final Fantasy VI, my personal favorite, and honestly the platinum plays out not too dissimilarly from Final Fantasy V. There's a ton of missable locations, missable chests, missable bestiary entries, and after the halfway point, you'll have no way of returning to the World of Balance to get anything you missed. So again, diligence, diligence, diligence. Fortunately, a lot of the trophies are to learn all of the skills for some characters, learn enough enemy techniques for Gao and Strago, and fortunately, not all of them, or Gao might actually drive you insane. There's an old version of Final Fantasy VI that used to, it still exists, but it's just not on PlayStation, and it's like kind of defunct in a sense. That had an achievement to learn every skill, and that would have driven you insane, so count your blessings. And then other than that, you just need to usually participate in most content. Win 10 Coliseum battles super easy, and a bunch of other stuff. There are also some other really annoying enemies. A big one is in Tangier, who must be defeated before the end of the World of Balance, and requires, I would say, extensive game knowledge in order to beat. Most people will just Google a strategy to beat in Tangier, because it's otherwise a very silly enemy that's quite cryptic. So that's one I want to make particular note of. Now, speaking of frustrating trophies, I think Final Fantasy VI has the potential to have the single most frustrating trophy of the entire video, Master Gambler. This requires you to perform Joker's death on Setzer with a perfect 777 slot machine roll. This inflicts death on all of your opponents when done correctly. Now, this achievement does not count if you land on the fake Joker's death, which is a different combination of slots. The fake Joker's death will instead instantly kill your entire party. If that one counted, trust me, this would be a very easy achievement. Now, there are two ways to approach this trophy. The first is to just auto battle with Setzer in the game and have him set to his slot command, and just accept any accidental game overs you get in the process. You're gonna get a lot of Joker's deaths that just actually kill your party. Fortunately, the game auto saves pretty frequently, and you can manually save in a bunch of locations. You can also just choose to put this off until you're just kind of doing nothing. Maybe just kill some like random overworld mobs with just Setzer, and again, just accept the results that he gets. But honestly, this method, probably the one that drove me insane when I did this on the Steam version, because that is how I did it on the Steam version. It took me over 15 hours of dedicated Joker's death farming before I saw him do it, and let me tell you, it was cathartic to know I was finally done. However, the more common method is to pause cheese his slots. Basically, as the slots are spinning, you pause the game and only press the confirm button after unpausing when you're sure that the slots are in the correct area. That way you can try to manipulate the game into giving you a 777. Now, you're probably thinking, oh, if I'm just pausing and then pressing X when it's about to be on the 7, this should be pretty easy, right? Well, you'd be about 2/3 correct. Unfortunately, the first two 7s are actually pretty reliable, but the third one, not so much. I've heard some people say that the game is hard-coded to really try to weigh that third 7 against you to counteract pause cheesing. I don't know the validity of that claim, but it sure does feel that way when you're doing it, because even if you're frame perfect on your pause, it just still often misses the 7. This requires requires a whole lot more effort than the other method, and you may still spend hours on it, but you probably won't have any accidental game overs. However, there's also the chance you're done in 5 to 10 minutes, so you know, that's just how it's going to roll. I personally took about 45 minutes doing this for my trophy, though I failed for probably about 2 hours when I tried that on the Steam version, hence why I started going with the auto battle method instead. Now, if you're looking to try and do this yourself, for the first pause, you're just going to want to try to pause the game on the chocobo symbol right before the 7. Unpause, press X, and you should be good to go. For the second pause, you want to do it between the chocobo and the Bahamut before the 7. I actually went closer to the bottom of the chocobo because I found that any earlier than that, and I would often land on the chocobo itself, and any later than that, it would roll past the 7. Although you can have varying results with this. Now, the third pause, the big one that's tough, is actually between the Bahamut and the airship before the 7 on the slot. My successful attempt was closer to the top of the airship as opposed to the bottom of the Bahamut. So kind of still like on that symbol, on the actual airship symbol, just closer to the higher point of it. Listen, I had success, but I say that knowing full well that I paused it in that spot dozens of times before this actually works. So this is just going to frustrate you. This is going to potentially frustrate you a lot. And maybe it won't. For your sake, I hope it doesn't. Like, I hope you just, everything I said warning you, just like, what the heck, that was easy. For your sake, I sure hope that's what you experience. Other than that, I'm not really going to take the time to mention every individual zone, every missable chest, because the entire first half of the game is also missable technically if you don't finish it. And to me, that's the scarier thing. It's all the one-time location. It's just such a massive, like, look at this list on the screen. There's me just pulling up the wiki of literally missables in Final Fantasy. And Final Fantasy VI's list is just a big one. Even some of this stuff, it doesn't matter. Like, some of the stuff is not trophy relevant, but oof, it can be a rough one. So this will probably be the longest trophy of the batch. This one took me about 22 hours, I think, on PlayStation. Could have been done faster, in my opinion, but that's what I ended up with. So yeah, good luck with this one. And I think that's enough platinum trophies to cover in a single video. That's it for the 2D series of games at the very least. And next I will be moving on to the 3D series of Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9. I'll tell you right now that Final Fantasy 7 and 8, pretty easy platinum trophies, minus 1 or 2 in each game. Whereas Final Fantasy 9, it's a special case. We'll get to that when we get to it. Anyway, that is going to be a wrap for my video on my platinum trophy journey. And if you plan on joining me, let me know in the comment section of the video below. I am currently working on Final Fantasies 13 and 13-2, and those will actually be my final trophies. So I've got plenty of stuff lined up that I can do videos for discussing my journey with these. And if you're interested in that Final Fantasy 11 platinum trophy run, in air quotes that you can't see because I'm recording this with audio and not video, let me know. I'll give it a thought. One of those trophies has me a little nervous about that idea, but I can probably manage, baby. I'll hate it, but all the same. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care.